section of Isaiah 2 through 4 and 9 through 12. It's just a fascinating section. We have pictures of Israel's coming into their destiny in the Millennium Kingdom under Jesus' rule, but also Israel having to go through the day of the Lord in order to get there, in order to receive the blessings. Some of the most visible vignettes of the coming age we have in this section. So let's just begin with Isaiah 2 through 4. Some of my favorite sections are in this. In Isaiah 2, we have a picture of Jesus ruling on the mountain of the Lord as the greater Solomon, teaching the nations his ways, teaching the Sermon on the Mount culture, and the nations are coming and streaming up to the mountain to be taught by Jesus. And it's remarkable here because what we see is that the nations are learning his ways and they're changing their national defense budgets. They're taking their spears and their swords and they're turning them into pruning hooks, into plowshares. They're using the resources now for agrarian means, which means the population on the earth will be booming. To feed all of them, they're going to have to resort to making more agricultural implements. And so this is what's happening under Jesus' leadership in the millennial age. So we have that in chapter 2. And then in chapter 4, we have Israel as the holy nation, purged by Jesus at the end of the Great Tribulation, a holy people. And we see something greater than what we saw at Sinai when God initially betrothed himself to Israel with that massive mountain and him coming down in fire. We see Jesus there on the mountain in Jerusalem, and it's fire over Jerusalem as a greater Sinai, a greater place of encounter with the Jewish people holy, completely his, like they've never been before in human history. And this is the product of Jesus returning and purging his own people. And it even says there's a canopy over the mountain of Jerusalem. I just want you to picture that canopy. There's fire and then a canopy. And so when people come to be a pilgrim and they're coming up to Jerusalem, not only is this high mountain, Isaiah 2, that's chief above all the other mountains, but it's also on fire and it's shining gloriously with the glory of Jesus. And it's that city on a hill, Matthew 5, that Jesus talked about. And so in Isaiah 4, we see another glimpse of the holy people fully married or in full unity with Jesus. But how we get there is the rest of Isaiah 2 and 3, which is the day of the Lord, which is God taking the nation that's mostly hard-hearted or unrepentant and walking them through discipline. And so we have in Isaiah 2, God removing the silver, the greed, the idolatry, the sorcery, removing all those things. And so it's humbling the pride of man. And in Isaiah 3, we see God just coming against, at the beginning of Isaiah 3, leadership in Jerusalem that was resistant to him. And then the other part of Isaiah 3, we see his addressing the oppression as seen in all these ornate decorations that the women of Jerusalem had, the oppression, the luxury, the greed. So all these things will be humbled in order to produce this holy nation in Isaiah 4. So these are some excellent pictures of what the Lord's going to do for Israel in the future. Now go on to Isaiah 9 through 12, which is kind of another subsection in this same section. And we have, again, some unique material that only Isaiah has in all the Bible. And we actually have a pattern here that if you just read it, you'd miss. And I want you to see it. And it's that God will use the ancient Assyrian Empire, which is modern-day Iraq, Syria, parts of Turkey, use that empire to come into Israel as a disciplining tool. And so that's part of the future Antichrist empire. We see that right here in this section. And Isaiah 9 starts with that battle just being over. It's mysteriously over. We never saw it happen. And Jesus vanquishes the foes in northern Israel and defeats the Antichrist army. And then his glory and his light shines out. And then, of course, we have some of the very popular Christmas passages about the son being born and the child being born, the son given to us. But it's actually not just a first coming passage, it's a second coming passage because it's Jesus putting the government on his shoulder, Jesus being on the throne of David, coming back as a human king to be there forever on the earth. That's Isaiah 9. Now in Isaiah 10, easily overlooked, and many times we'd read just because there's just too many details, but it shows us the pride and arrogance of historical Assyria, but that same pride and arrogance and military power will return in the Middle East, and it will come and God will use it as a tool to cause Israel to be disciplined, cause them to turn back to him. And at the end of Isaiah 10, something happens. It's I think verses 24 through 32. But what's remarkable is that the Lord lists how he's going to defeat this empire. And it's in the manner of Egypt, as in 10 plagues, as in miraculous super plagues against an empire to weaken them, to destroy them. And it's in the manner of Gideon's defeat, which was a small Israeli army with a supernatural deliverance suddenly. And that has not happened historically to Assyria, how the Lord defeated them. And in addition, he lists like 10 cities from the north to the south in an approach from an enemy empire, Assyrian empire. And this approach never happened historically from an Assyrian king. Sennacherib or any other ones never approached Jerusalem as listed in verses 28 through 34 in Isaiah 10. And so these are some very specific route of the Antichrist coming to Jerusalem and laying siege. And so this is one of the very unique verses here about his approach and what he's going to be doing in the land when he returns. Then we get to 11 and 12. And then in 11, we have now a picture of Assyria being crushed again. And now we have a picture of Jesus in the millennial kingdom. Isaiah 11 is the clearest passage in the Bible of Jesus' millennial reign. It's the clearest about his character and his qualities, his divinity, and his human ancestry all together in one. And especially from verses 1 through 5, we just see so much about that. We see that his rule will affect the poor unlike any human leader ever. I mean, his form of government, he will run it just like he came in his first coming. It says in his first coming, he emptied himself all of that was God and took the form of a servant, and he listened to everything the Father did, empowered by the Holy Spirit in his ministry. His second coming, he's coming in glory, but he's still listening to the Father in everything he does, and the sevenfold Spirit's on him to accomplish this task. He has the full resources of heaven to bring heaven's rule to earth. So there's no human king ever like this, and it will lift the poor up out of the ground. It'll actually solve poverty like no other human government has, like Confucianism, Marxism, capitalism. Jesus will by far surpass all of that by how he listens to the Father. And then when we go to the rest of Isaiah 11, we now see what he does in his rule on the millennial earth. And like I said, this is the clearest we have in the Bible, all in one passage. And in fact, the rest of Isaiah unpacks these themes. These are seed form. It gives us some of the millennial elements in seed form. For example, we have in Isaiah 11, chapter 11, verse 6 on through 8, just how he's going to restore the animal life, the animal kingdom, and that they won't be destroying each other, and even the weakest human being, a child, can now be a ruler and lead the animal life. And we'll see in Isaiah 11:10 that worship will abound on the earth in Jerusalem, and Jesus is the center of the worship movement, that they're going to come and seek him and he'll be glorious. We also see the theme of the Israeli remnant after the war, those who survived, those who weren't raptured because they weren't Christians, those who weren't killed but survived, that are now coming back from nations within the Middle East to go back into the land to repopulate it. We see that theme here very clearly in Isaiah. And we see that God's even building a highway for them. And then we see another theme that the prophets unpack, which is some of the Jewish people that are weak and broken will actually rise up and attack their surrounding enemies. And so there's just so many themes here that the Lord is giving us in the millennial kingdom in Isaiah 11. And then it finishes in Isaiah 12, which is a song. It's a song of deliverance. It's a song that sings God's praises and teaches the nations how good God has been to Israel and what they've learned and discovered about him because of their deliverance and all they've been through in the Great Tribulation. And it's very much like the first Exodus. After the children of Israel were delivered out of the 10 plagues, they sang a song after Pharaoh was drowned in the ocean or out of the Red Sea. They sang this song in Exodus 15. Now, all the nation of Israel that was just delivered out of 21 plagues against a greater person than Pharaoh, the Antichrist, they're singing a song now, and it's a global song, and it teaches the nations, it releases God's glory. And so really, chapter 12 and helps tie up this section of Isaiah 1 through 12 and how God will save Israel, what it will look like when he does, and how the nations are even benefited by this salvation.